Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report. As Election Day nears, campaigns make the final sprint to the finish line. How are candidates trying to win over undecided voters? What can early voting tell us? And will we see historic turnout on Election Day? On the national stage, campaign rhetoric reaches new levels. What kind of impact is it having? And how are Utah's leaders reacting? Finally, what kind of influence will our newly elected leaders have?
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Dennis Romboy with the Deseret News, Taylor Stevens with the Salt Lake Tribune, and Glen Mills with ABC4 News. So glad to have you all on the show today. It's kind of my favorite time of year. We're a few days away from the elections, and it all comes together, and we have some very important topics to go through today. Glen, I'm going to start with you on the first question. The hottest race we have, Congressional District 4, Mia Love, Ben McAdams. And you're looking at polls, we have a couple outliers, but mostly people are showing this race is virtually neck and neck. Why is that?
Well, you mentioned it. This is the race we're watching here in the state of Utah, but not only here in the state of Utah, but across the country as well. This is, according to most of the polls, as you say, a toss-up within the margin of error. At this point, most people are looking at it saying this could go one way or another. The reason why is because we have a strong Democratic candidate up against a Republican incumbent, and the balance of power in the United States Congress, in the House of Representatives, is up for grabs, and this seat is right in the mix. That's why we're seeing so much attention on it right now, and that's why it's such a heated race here in the state of Utah.
So Dennis, we've been talking about this blue wave idea, at least in the House. I mean, were people expecting Utah would be part of that?
I don't think so. Utah, this district's traditionally, most of our districts have traditionally been Republican. However, this 4th district has had a Democrat in the past, in Jim Matheson, who had that for one term after he jumped from a previous district. So it wouldn't be out of the question for a Democrat to be elected from the 4th district. It's happened before.
Taylor, as you're talking with people out there about the press itself, about the media that's coming, a lot of outside money flowing into this race. How are people viewing these outside interests as they're trying to impact this race?
You know, I think we don't have, as we've noted, a lot of races that are very competitive in Utah generally. So seeing this outside money flow in, I think that we are seeing some more negative campaign ads and more negative campaigning in general. And I think that's something that Utahns aren't really used to, and is definitely keeping their attention on this race.
The question is whether that's effective or not, right? Are these negative ads effective? Traditionally, we've said in Utah that doesn't really work. It seems like to me they might be having an impact this time. We're repeatedly seeing the same ads over and over again. I would think that they may have some impact and bearing on how people vote.
When we talk about this seat being in the mix, let's not forget that Ben McAdams lives in the 2nd congressional district. He saw the 4th as one that he could be more competitive in, and so he ran in that race. Now, it's perfectly fine. He can do that, and his argument for doing that is that the majority of the 4th congressional district is the people who are familiar with him and his work as Salt Lake County Mayor. But that's how, important this race is, that probably the most electable Democrat in the state of Utah went beyond his own congressional district into the 4th because he knew that's where he could be more competitive.
Well, it's an interesting point because these are two candidates that Utahns seem to know pretty well. Dennis, is that changing the makeup of that? And maybe how does that relate to how the negative campaigns went?
Well, I mean, obviously we know these candidates, right? And I don't know if we expected them to go as negative as they did. And I think it does have an impact on the race and on them as people. I think we view them differently now than we probably did prior to this election.
And on their own relationship. We've reported in the past that these two did have kind of a close friendship, and that I think has dissolved as this race has gone really negative in the last few weeks.
I think it tells you they both see how much is on the line here and that they are both willing, because it's not just the outside groups that turn this negative. This race was negative before the outside groups came into it. So they both see a lot is on the line. They both want to do everything they can to win, and we saw it take that turn early on in the campaign.
Let's talk about at least one of those things that has happened just this week, sort of the dueling letters, right? Dennis, you've seen the McAdams campaign talking about this potential violation of the FEC, and then, of course, the Mia Love saying, hey, this is not part of the investigation anymore. We've been cleared of that. Explain that to us just a little bit.
Well, these letters really are coming from people within the FEC, lawyers. It's not the commission itself that's making the decision. That's where this ultimately rests, especially with the Better Utah complaint that was filed. Until the commission itself rules on this, these are just, I think, opinions coming from within the FEC. I don't know that there's a lot of weight behind them. It's not upholding the complaint. It's also not exonerating Mia Love from violating any campaign rules. It's
interesting we talk about exoneration or what it really means. Were you about to have a comment on that?
Well, I was just going to say this is a clear example of their strategies to define one another as opposed to defining themselves. I mean, if you look at these ads, do we even know what the substance is anymore? I have to ask that question. I think a lot of people wonder that. But clearly they are both trying to define the other one as opposed to themselves at this point.
Is it sticking then? This negativity, particularly on this potential fundraising effort, is it sticking right now in this race?
It seems, well, Mia Love keeps bringing it up. I thought maybe it was over a week ago, and then now they have another letter, right? And so then the Better Utah has another letter, and it just kind of keeps going back and forth. It seems to be sticking.
And as you said, in some ways it's a self-inflicted wound that Mia Love has created. She told reporters they should call the FEC and that she would be exonerated, and we did, and that wasn't what we heard, you know. So in some ways they are perpetuating this, her campaign.
Before we leave this particular race, I'm curious about your views as members of the press when you have two well-known candidates. I mean, sometimes when you have a known incumbent running and a newcomer that no one knows, how have you approached this race in your reporting since we know these people so well? Glenn, how has that changed your coverage?
I'd have to say it hasn't really changed my coverage. My objective is always to present fairly both sides, and I've tried to take that same strategy in this case. However, we've probably covered this case or this race more than some of the others because of the interest that is shown on it.
What kind of impact is sort of the negativity of this race having on people and their willingness to show up in the polls? Taylor, you've been looking into this a little bit. Is it motivating people to show up for their candidate, or is it having any kind of a chilling effect?
You know, we did have a poll with the Hinckley Institute of Politics that looked at what is motivating people to get out this campaign season. And more than kind of negativity or particular candidates, the number one thing that we are hearing is the propositions, Proposition 2 particularly on medical marijuana. So the initiatives, I think, are a big push. After that, President Trump, and then particular candidates. So I'm not sure. I think in CD4, maybe the negativity is pushing some people to kind of get out and vote because they feel maybe they could have a decisive vote in this, but I think more than anything, the ballots are pushing people out.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think without the ballot propositions and the question, this is probably more like your typical run-of-the-mill midterm election. If we take a look, what we know is registration's way up. Turnout already is way up. So what's different between this and the last midterm election? These propositions. And I think definitely that's what's driving people out to the polls this time around.
What kind of impact, Dennis, is this early voting, this mail-in balloting having on this election?
I think people are voting. In Salt Lake County alone, more than 40% have already cast their ballots. A quarter of all registered voters apparently have cast their ballots. I think people, in a lot of cases, have made up their minds fairly early on where they're going on the propositions, on their candidates, and have cast their votes, and then can kind of be done with this. No more robocalls. You know, I don't need to watch these ads anymore. I can just go about my business. I've done my civic duty and voted.
Taylor, as you're interviewing people on your stories here, that's an interesting statistic you was just saying. 1 in 4 Utahns have already voted before the election even gets here. How are the candidates in all these races reacting to that when they know they've already lost their opportunity, or maybe they got the opportunity for these particular voters?
I think that in a way the whole campaign has changed now, because you do have to kind of hit messaging hard early on. Now I think the campaign strategy is kind of pivoted toward how can we reach these voters who haven't turned their ballots in yet, and they're able to get a daily report from the state of who hasn't turned it in, and they're able to robocall those people, knock those doors, and in a way that's maybe a more specific strategy. So it might actually benefit them.
It's becoming very specific. The Republican Party is going out this weekend specifically looking at Republicans who typically vote straight party ticket who have not yet cast their ballots. That's how specific they can get and knock on that particular door and talk to that voter.
And even though we have a lot of those votes already in, and the election cycle certainly does start early, it's still full speed ahead for all the candidates trying to get these last-minute undecided voters.
Every one of them certainly matters. One of the issues that has come up this week, and Dennis, I want to start with you on this, is sort of the rhetoric that comes out of Washington, D.C., kind of the discussion who you blame for whatever's happening. And it seems to be kind of a topic of conversation around our dinner tables now in the state of Utah. You had an article, in fact, just today, talking about a letter from Mitt Romney, talking about how you address the blame. Sometimes it turns out you all get blamed, the members of the press. I want to show a graphic from Mitt Romney in this letter, and then I just really want to get your idea about how you think this plays in Utah. Mitt Romney said, "As a political tactic, it may be brilliant, but it comes with a large cost to the cause of freedom." This is blaming the press. What do you say to that as a member of the press?
I think he's talking about the president, referring to the press. He said it's the fake news in general, but as an enemy of the people. And that is a way, I think, to get his base riled up and to get his supporters to kind of fall in line with his views on things. And in doing that, that might be good strategy to kind of rile up, people, conservatives or whoever might be supporting him. But the harm it causes is that it calls into question everything that the reporters do. It calls into question our watchdog function on government, which is a hallmark of the press. And it negates all the good things the press has done over the years. I mean, without the press, we wouldn't know about Watergate. We wouldn't know about priests abusing young children. And so it does kind of weaken democracy and freedom by really hammering on a free press. It's a hallmark of our Constitution and of our society.
Just thought I'd share a personal experience real quick. I was in Washington in 2017 for the inauguration of President Trump, and it was after the inauguration. We were down by the White House getting, file video for our stories and whatnot, and someone comes up to me and he says, "Trump won, media zero." And I looked at him and I said, "Have you ever even seen anything I've ever reported?" And he's all, "No." But he didn't care. That was the mindset of this individual, and there are plenty more just like him, that this idea of, us versus them, media versus Trump.
So, Taylor, this gets to a little bit of the question about whether the words matter, right? And we have this conversation, it's like, who's to blame? But to what extent are you sensing that the words coming out of Washington, D.C. from some of these elected officials are having a negative impact, particularly through the lens of shootings in Pittsburgh, people mailing bombs through the mail? Is there a correlation there? Is that the right way to look at what's happening?
Well, we talked about that, Trump is motivating some voters to get out this cycle, and whether that's motivating them to vote for Democrats, we don't know, but he is motivating people to get out and go to the polls. As for the divisive rhetoric and trying to rile up the base, I'm not sure that that is as needed here, where we have so many kind of reliably red districts. And so I think that a lot of our candidates are able to denounce that rhetoric in a way that they might not be able to do if they were in a tighter race, because it is a reliably red already.
Although I haven't heard other candidates really denounce that strongly. Mitt Romney doesn't even mention President Trump by name in the essay that he wrote. He says the president, and that we see that kind of a lot. Is they'll kind of criticize him, but they'll do it without kind of indirectly.
It's a careful line.
It's a very
Definitely.
careful line, that they're trying to walk here, especially incumbents Republicans who need to work with them still.
And we have seen lukewarm support for Trump kind of historically, and so I think they want to keep with the base, but also, abhor some of that rhetoric in a way.
One interesting note along those lines is the birthright citizenship issue that came up recently. The one race that we've been talking about already that is close here in the state of Utah, Mia Love and Ben McAdams, Representative Love was the first one to come out from our delegation and say, no, this isn't right. You cannot unilaterally change the Constitution.
Okay, I want to kind of connect to something that Taylor was talking a moment ago. It was about the what's motivating people to show up. And one of those things clearly was Proposition 2 on marijuana. I just want to make sure we talk about this for a moment, because we'll not just people have a chance to vote on it, but there have been some turns just this week in terms of the timing. Taylor, why don't you take a second on that, since you brought it up for us. How is the legislature approaching this, if it does pass or if it doesn't pass?
So I believe that we've reported that if it does pass, they're going to wait to hold a special session until December. And if it doesn't pass, they're going to hold one in November. So what the legislature has said is that they are going to act on medical marijuana kind of either way. However, I think that having strong support from voters at the polls for Prop 2 will, it could make a difference in how the legislature moves forward.
Okay. Let's get to one that I think is just so interesting that we haven't talked a lot about, Amendment C. In case for the sake of thoroughness, the legislature calling them into special session. Glenn, I know you were looking at this issue this week. Turns out we're looking at who is supporting it and who's against it. We finally find out who's opposed. Let me talk about that for a moment.
Well, I think we knew all along who was opposed to it, right? But now we're seeing money put into it to oppose it as well from the governor's political action committee. I refer to this as Amendment Chaffetz, because that's how this all began. When he decided to step aside, the governor came up with this timeline to host the election, the special election to replace him. The legislature didn't like it. They wanted the governor to call them into special session, and he refused to do it. So that's really what this is all centered about. And it's a balance of power. It's a power issue. The governor sees this as the legislature trying to take some of the power that he has to call them into special session. And that's what this really boils down to. And that's why you're seeing the governor's PAC put some money into it.
Go ahead.
Well, I can see good arguments on both sides for this. The legislature feels like they're the body that makes the laws. They should be able to call themselves into session when needed. And this proposition, this amendment, would be very narrow in focus. It would allow them to call themselves into special session in emergencies, fiscal crisis, situations like that. Emergency, though, I guess could be pretty broadly defined. And so there may be some danger in that. None of the legislators I talk to want this to become a full-time legislature where they call themselves into session routinely throughout the year. But I can understand the governor's point of view too. This is his prerogative under the Constitution, and he's putting his money where his mouth is right now.
Glenn, what's going to happen in the executive branch if this does pass? How is the governor going to react?
He's a guy that would probably be disappointed, but he respects the will of the people as well. I guess it could potentially go into litigation afterward, but from what I've noticed of him, he, like I said, he respects the will of the people, and I guess we would just kind of have to wait and see if he would decide to take any action afterward.
Okay, now this is going to be a fun part of the show. We're just putting you on the spot for just a moment. I'm kind of curious about what races you're watching and what you are looking for on election night. Dennis, we're going to start with you, all right? When you think about your excitement for that night, what is it, this foundation of it?
Anticlimactic, I think I would describe it. I cover the Senate race. Mitt Romney has a large lead there. I cover the 2nd Congressional District, which was Chris Stewart and Shireen Garbani, who's done an excellent job in going out and meeting with voters and getting some enthusiasm going and going house to house and that type of thing. But I just don't think she has it this year to win that election. So
you're seeing right now Chris Stewart is fine.
I think Chris Stewart's fine. Mitt Romney, I think, is fine. I don't cover the 4th district, but whoever does is in for a long night and maybe a long 2 weeks until the canvass is complete. It could be that close.
Okay, good. Taylor.
I think all eyes will be on Congressional District 4. What I'm really interested to see is how the margins come out, and whether it will be too close to call that night, and whether we'll have to wait and see if Utah has the chance to flip the House blue or not. I think it could come down to that. We'll just have to wait and see.
Okay.
I'm really interested in Proposition 2, especially with everything that's going on around it with the compromise. I personally believe that when we talk about the propositions driving people to the polls, this one is the one that's driving people to the polls the most. So a lot of these people that are just newly registering, haven't voted before or in a long time, how are they going to vote in other races? I think that's going to be fascinating, especially a close race like the 4th District, where a lot of people are coming for Proposition 2 alone to the polls. You know, are they going to tend to lean more toward Love? Are they going to tend to lean more toward McAdams? That proposition alone could have a pretty significant impact on that race. But also, I think the interesting part is we have this compromise in the works. The legislature saying, you know what, no matter what happens, we're going to get this done. So it makes me wonder, you know, how does that impact this race? Does it make the people that lean right, who were coming to the polls for Proposition 2, say, okay, it's going to be taken care of, I'm not going to worry about it anymore, and those who lean left are still, you know, taking the hard line and making sure they're getting out? I think that's a big possibility, and that could have an impact on other races. But also, the person voting for Proposition 2 probably likely to vote for Proposition 3 and Proposition 4 as well.
Dennis, is that what you're hearing?
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that those things are getting people out to vote, and they will definitely have impact in other races.
Tell me about your conversations with people in the state of Utah about their trust in what happens next on Proposition 2. Let's take the two hypotheticals. One is it does pass, and if it does, they'll wait a little bit of time to let the law go into effect and fix it in December. And as Taylor said, if it doesn't, they'll do it in November. Tell us how the legislature is navigating that, and people in Utah say, I feel confident.
I think they do. I mean, the only choice is to trust them. I don't know that whatever the legislature passes will satisfy everybody. Certainly won't satisfy the people that are pushing Proposition 2. They've already said they don't care for the draft legislation that's in place, whether they can effectively change some of that and move it toward more what the proposition says. I kind of doubt that, but I don't know that anyone will be satisfied after the legislature weighs in.
Well, what do you think the legislature is going to do if it doesn't pass? If it's under 50%? I mean, how much of this do people in Utah think they're really going to grab and put into place?
I think they're going to do something. I think they've said that, and I think that we need to hold them to that. The Speaker has said that, the Senate President said that, the Governor has said that. Again, what they ultimately come up with, that's the question.
It would be really embarrassing for them, having gone on record publicly. Every newspaper, every media outlet in the state has them on record, on video, or on tape, or whatever means, saying we will get this done. It would be very embarrassing for the governor, for Speaker Hughes, for President Niederhauser not to get that done. And I'll just add this: I have personally had conversations with some of the lawmakers who have kind of been leading ahead in the anti-Proposition 2 effort, and they like the compromise. So I think there's movement within those who have really been anti-Prop 2 to get something done.
Just adding on to that, I think a lot of people view the need for so many ballot initiatives as a failure on the part of the legislature to act. And so if the legislature does not make some kind of movement on this, I think that it is going to make them look pretty bad.
I want to talk about one corollary to this medicinal marijuana approach, and that's whether or not Utahns are tying any of this to the overall question of health care in the United States. For a while, this was something that President Trump talked about, was the Affordable Care Act. And as you may recall, we're going to repeal that. It's like my first few days, I'm going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Are people still associating any of these health care issues with topics like Proposition 2 in the state? Are we even talking about the Affordable Care Act anymore? Dennis?
I don't really see a lot of correlation there. I haven't really looked into that very deeply to see if there's really a correlation there. It seems like the Prop 2 is separate from Affordable Care Act, and we haven't really kind of meshed those two things together.
Well, Prop 3 is entirely tied to the Affordable Care Act. It would expand Medicaid as intended under the Affordable Care Act, and we've already had a lawmaker come out and say, if that passes, I'm presenting a bill to repeal it. So that one certainly is tied to the fight over the Affordable Care Act. But it's been really surprising to me that the opposition has been fairly non-existent and not very organized on Proposition 3, because this has been a very, very heated battle for years at the state capitol.
And now we're not even really seeing formalized opposition.
Like Proposition 2 has taken all the wind out of all of the others.
So putting these things into context, I'm just curious what you think about the role that Utah plays on the national stage with Mitt Romney potentially winning this race, and even with a potential change. Glenn, you and I have talked about this a few times in the past. A second, is Utah continuing to be quite influential in D.C., and will this election make it so we remain that way or even increase?
Well, that's Mitt Romney's whole campaign pitch, right? Is, look, I'm not your typical junior senator. I can come in here, I have the connections, people know me from my run for president, and I can go in and I can take an immediate leadership role and have an immediate impact. And people are looking at that, and I think they're in a lot of ways agreeing with what he's saying there. So he definitely could. And as far as House District 4, we've already talked about, it's right in the mix of the balance of power for the House of Representatives.
I think the state's power will be diminished federally to some degree because you have Senator Hatch leaving. Like him, hate him, whatever, he does wield a tremendous amount of power. He does have the president's ear on certain things, and the president has talked to him on issues. So Mitt Romney obviously can come in there with a lot of credibility, but it won't be near at the level as what Senator Hatch has it at this moment.
Taylor, what about if Ben McAdams does, these are all just what ifs, if he does, is he coming in as a traditional kind of Democrat there with the House? What kind of influence can he have?
I think that McAdams really sees himself as a moderate, and he has kind of positioned himself as somebody who's going to work across the aisle. As a Democrat in Utah, you need to be able to work across the aisle. And so I think that he is somebody who would see his role as coming into Congress and trying to fix that gridlock we have.
It's going to have to be our last comment. Thank you very much. That's it for this edition of the Hinckley Report. For more on this week's news, visit us online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. Thank you and good night.